We're going to talk about the afterlife and the Messiah, which are two related but separate concepts. And they're concepts about which there's sort of a lot of, I don't know, I guess kind of misinformation or just unknown out there for most people. I find it a very interesting subject. Just to start a little poll, how many people think Judaism believes in heaven and hell? Do we believe in heaven and hell? Could I give one of those fire and brimstone sermons like a Baptist minister?
You might not get the sermon, but
How many people say yes? How many people say no?
Kind of a trick question.
How many people are clueless?
what about one and not
It
the
doesn't cost
other?
anything to vote.
Oh, what, so you believe in hell but not heaven?
The other way
The
around.
other way around, okay.
I thought there was
So-
sort of a dark place that everyone wants to go.
Okay, so that's why y'all are here.
Wait a minute. We have actually been to hell.
You've been to hell?
Yeah,
Yeah?
it's in the Cayman Islands.
Okay.
It's town
Called
called
hell.
hell.
Okay, there you go.
And you
So
made it back.
there is hell. There's also a hell in Montana or somewhere, because I've seen pictures of hell frozen over. How many people think Judaism believes in reincarnation? So we got like 2 or 3 or maybe, how many people say reincarnation? No, that's not Jewish.
Well, isn't there something about in the Kabbalah? No, in one of the paragraphs about, you come back or something. It's different.
Or something.
Hayei Meitim Barachamim.
Rabbi, right,
Yeah.
who brings life to the dead.
But no,
Right.
I
So-
thought it was everyone just came back now. You were reincarnated as something.
Right.
someone
So
else.
that's the idea of Tichiyat HaMeitim, the bringing the dead to life, is not exactly the same as reincarnation. That's you're dead and you get to be alive again.
Okay, okay.
So
There is an example
yeah.
of reanimation. Anyway, we read it in Haftarah.
Right. So Ezekiel and the dry bones. Right. So that's a famous source, and we'll talk about that today as well. And then we'll talk about Messiah somewhat separately. Both of these things together are part of a branch of theology we call teleology, which means the sort of end purpose, the end goal, the final ultimate purpose of things is teleology. So that's what we're talking about tonight. So if you want to impress your friends, you tell them you studied teleology. So the truth is there's no single authoritative Jewish position on the afterlife, but the truth is it's considered sort of mainstream to believe in heaven and hell. I absolutely could give a fire and brimstone sermon just like one of the Baptists down the block if I were so inclined and use nothing but Jewish sources. So we definitely got all that stuff in there. We just don't talk about it so much. And this is where we get into one of the big differences between Judaism and Christianity. We don't focus that much on what you believe. We focus on what you do. So the truth is, what happens after you die? None of us is really that sure. So there's a lot of stuff out there about it, but there's no halakha, for example, that says you must believe this to be a good Jew. So there's all sorts of speculation in traditional rabbinic sources. It's interesting to note that in a survey taken way back in 1965, only 17% of Jews believed in an afterlife. The rest either didn't or admitted to not knowing. So I'm now just going to give you some highlights of this summary source, Summary of Jewish Views of the Afterlife. It's a great book. For anybody who's interested in the subject, I recommend getting the book. He gives a very good description of not only our views on the afterlife, but how the views evolved over time. And so there's just a real mishmash of different things that you see. But what I would say, sort of normative Judaism would say is the Jewish metaphor for what happens after death is as follows. Immediately following death, there's a period known as Kibut HaKever, the pangs of the grave. During this period, the soul is confused, lingers around the body, and tries to go back to his home and be with his loved ones. And so this is one, and some of our customs around death and mourning come from some of these ideas. So for example, this is one of the reasons why we cover mirrors at a Shiva home. There are two reasons for that. One reason is that you're not supposed to be focused on vanity and what you look like, and you're just not supposed to pay attention to it. And the other reason is that they say that the soul of the departed hangs out at the Shiva home, and if looks in the mirror and doesn't see himself, they'll be freaked out. So you cover the mirrors so that doesn't happen. After that, there's a maximum period of 12 months in Gehinna, or Gehinom, which is Hebrew for hell. It's an actual physical place. It's a valley just outside the walls of the old city of Jerusalem. One of the things that I find remarkable is the Temple Mount, of course, is symbolic of our connecting point to heaven. And the Temple Mount is located maybe not more than half a mile from hell. So the distance between heaven and hell is a rather short distance. The realm of Gehinna is described as a fiery realm where the soul is purified of its sins. And so therefore, what we call Gehinnom or hell is what Catholics would call purgatory. So we take the approach, we don't believe in original sin, instead we believe in original purity. So the idea is you're born in original purity. In fact, we have a blessing we say in the morning, first thing on our rising, Elohai neshama shenatata bi taharahi, my God, the soul that you've given me is pure. But as we go through our life, we kind of mess it up a little bit. We do some things that maybe we aren't so proud of. And it's as if you had a beautiful, pure, golden ball of a soul, and you were throwing mud and junk and crap and crud all over the top of it to where it got to that you couldn't even see that beautiful ball of gold was in there. And hell then is a process of purification to remove the dross, just like if you had gold ore and you had to get rid of the impure stuff, to have the gold left behind. So that's what Gehinnom is viewed at. It's a process of purification to bring the soul back to its original state of purity. And that process is said to take 12 months. Now, this is where the custom of saying Kaddish to your parents for 11 months comes from. So you say, well, why 11 months and not 12 months? Rabbi Moses ben Israel Israelis of Krakow said, well, if 12 months in Gehinnom is the maximum punishment for sinners, you wouldn't want to think that your parents were such bad sinners that they get the maximum punishment. So it's like by the time 11 months have gone by, surely they've gone on to the better place.
Does that mean that everybody's soul is there for 11?
No, the amount of time you spend there corresponds to how wicked you are. So if you were completely righteous, you just go straight to Olam Haba, to the world to come.
An infant or a child wouldn't spend any time.
Wouldn't spend any time. Just and if you think your parent was particularly wicked, you can say Kaddish for 12 months, but that would be considered somewhat disrespectful.
Can you say it?
That'd be punishment to the person.
Right.
Not that they're
And so after going through that process of purification, the soul goes to Olam Haba, the world to come. Gan Eden is viewed as another sort of transitory phase. Gan Eden is the Garden of Eden or paradise. And there's also in all the traditional sources a belief in Tchiyat HaMetim, the resurrection of the dead, which says that just like in that Haftorah from Ezekiel, that the dry bones will come, pop out of the grave and be alive again. And it's interesting, Maimonides had a lot of trouble with that idea. Maimonides is a very rational scientist rabbi 1,000 years ago. But he couldn't just say it's not going to happen because all the other rabbis would have frowned on that because it would have seemed to be denying a main tenet. So he said basically, at the end of days, all the dead people will pop out of their graves, be alive for 5 minutes, then go back in.
It's a lot of work.
A lot of work for 5 minutes. So it's and that principle is included in Rambam's 13 principles of faith, which is part of our liturgy. The song Yigdal that we often use to end the evening services posits a belief in the resurrection of the dead. The history and how the views on the afterlife developed over time is actually very interesting. Because if you look in the Bible, what does the Torah itself have to say about life after death? You think of any examples?
I can think about the one about the witches who summoned Samuel.
Right. So that's a good example. Because they have these witches summoning the spirit of the prophet Samuel, and the Torah cautions us against consulting with necromancers, is what they're called, those who call it the spirits of the dead, not because it doesn't work, but because you're supposed to leave the dead alone, because it's rude to go pestering it. So it says don't do that, not because it doesn't work, but because you shouldn't pester.
And I remember that Samuel complains about it.
Right, Samuel complains. He says, "What are you, leave me alone? It's not my concern anymore." In the Torah, it talks about Sheol. So you'll see references to Sheol. And Sheol is sort of a underground domain of the dead. It's not good. It's not bad. It's not punishment. It's not reward. Sheol is just where the dead go hang out. And that's all there is to it. Rich and poor, kings and sinners, everyone went to Sheol when they died. Various descriptions in the books of Daniel, Job, and Proverbs paint a picture of a bleak and forlorn subterranean realm. The residents of Sheol are called Rephaim, which are ghosts, literally weak or powerless ones. And so it's almost as if when a person dies, they still exist, but they have zero power. It's like a zero energy state. It would be like a electric charge that had zero amperage. There could still be some voltage, but no amperage behind it. So it's like static electricity or something. And the view of Sheol grew over time. As God grew from being the God of Israel to being God of the entire world, his power extended over Sheol as well. In Psalm 49, it says, "But God will redeem my soul from the power of Sheol and will receive me." And so in the early view of Sheol, the living could call on the inhabitants there for help, as we just talked about King Saul summoning Samuel. Later texts show the dead in Sheol being completely cut off from the world and unaware of what happens here. So then we get to the 6th century BCE. What happened in the 6th century BCE? Right, the temple was destroyed the first time. So the first destruction of the temple. And this was a great calamity for the Jewish people. And they had trouble understanding how it could happen. They felt that people weren't such bad sinners. How could they be punished this way? And this is where the idea of heaven and hell as reward and punishment starts to come into the tradition. And the idea is we are powerfully wedded to the idea of God being just. It would really be troubling to have a God who's not just. And so if it looks like things aren't just, and this is something we talked about before. Remember, we had the class on theodicy, the problem of evil. So one of the ways to solve the problem of evil is to say it works out just we don't see the whole picture. It balances out in the next world. So righteous people may be punished in this world, wicked may prosper, things may look out of whack, but you get to the next world and the scales get balanced. And that was a response to the destruction of the first temple. There was so much trouble living with that notion, but initially it was all just collective. It was sort of a collective punishment or collective reward. Afterwards, in the book of Jeremiah, is where we first start to see the notion of individual responsibility and retribution. and is clarified in Ezekiel. The person who sins, he alone shall die. A child shall not share the burden of a parent's guilt, nor shall a parent share the burden of a child's guilt. The righteousness of the righteous shall be accounted to him alone, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be accounted to him alone. So at this point, they're saying the rewards are in this world, the righteous continue to live, and the wicked die and go down to Sheol. In the book of Job, there's a notion of divine reward beyond the grave. Job professes the belief that after all his suffering, after his skin is peeled away, he'll see God. The rabbis later in the Midrash struggle to find sources for belief in resurrection. So resurrection, that idea of the, coming back to life, is found in Ezekiel with his famous vision of the valley of dry bones coming to life. And we would read that and think the guy was having a dream. That not necessarily you should take that literally, but the rabbis worked in a belief of seeing that more literally. In Isaiah, Sheol becomes a waiting place for the righteous where they pass their time until they're resurrected. In Daniel, the wicked will be punished and the righteous will be rewarded in post-mortem judgment. So Daniel, which is 2nd century BCE, clearly says after we die, the righteous are rewarded, the wicked are punished. And so that's when that sort of becomes a firm part of the Jewish beliefs. There's also a lot of literature that we call the Apocrypha. So the Apocrypha are things like the book of Maccabees that we talked about last week with the Hanukkah story, things that were sort of like books of the Bible that were floating around at the time the rabbis decided what was going to be in the Tanakh and the Hebrew Bible that didn't make the cut. But they were still equally old sources. And in some of those sources, there's a lot more description of the afterlife and the dualistic notion of Sheol and Gehenna being the place for the wicked, and paradise, Gan Eden, Olam Haba being for the righteous. And even though those sources aren't part of our official scripture, they still influence the ideas of the later rabbis because they still read that stuff even if it wasn't part of the Tanakh. In Rabbinic Judaism, spanning from the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 for about 1,000 years, the destruction of the temple and the establishment of the rabbis, yeshiva and Yavne, where they really reinvented Judaism, all of that had a profound influence on what they thought. And they started using the term of Olam Haba. So in the Talmud, you'll see a lot of references to Olam Haba, the world to come, without any really clear descriptions of what Olam Haba is. It's a place where people get rewarded, but it doesn't say what the reward is or what it looks like. There's no imagery in Talmudic literature of people with wings and halos and harps or anything like that. But there are some contradictory statements. For example, in Pirkei Avot, it says, better is 1 hour of life in the world to come than the whole of life in this world. Yeah. But in the next breath, the rabbi says, better is 1 hour of repentance and good works in this world than the whole life of the world to come. So directly contradicting which is the
the first
breath.
part sounds very Christian.
Mm-hmm.
The first part.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. The next world is better.
Right.
And there are also sources in the Talmud that say this world is nothing but a closed door, a corridor to Olam Haba. That it's all about Olam Haba. So those sort of ideas that we tend to think of as Christian, that forget about this world, it's all about the next world. You can find those in rabbinic sources as well. Christians didn't just make all that up on their own. We had traditional sources for that too. There was a split around the time of the destruction of the temple between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Pharisees were basically our ancestors. They were the founders of Rabbinic Judaism. The Sadducees were the priests and the priestly class that did all the rituals in the temple. The Sadducees did not believe in an afterlife. The Pharisees did. And the Sadducees just believed when you died, you were dead, that was it. There was nothing that continued. And so this was a great controversy 2,000 years ago. So it's not new that there are different opinions on this. There were different opinions 2,000 years ago. The Pharisees said that the Sadducees were heretics for denying the resurrection of the dead and ideas like that. And the Sadducees ended up sort of dying out completely because they were so wedded to the temple rituals that without a temple, they just sort of couldn't keep it going. In early Talmudic texts, Olam Haba is the time at the end of days when divine judgment will be meted out and many will be brought back to physical life. In this case, they're not talking about an immortal spiritual realm. That was something that came still later. The concept of judgment was very central to their view of Olam Haba, the world to come. There were a lot of different ideas about what happened at death and what happened right after death. They taught that there are 903 different kinds of death in the world. The most difficult and painful due to a form of choking, and the easiest like a kiss, like drawing a hair out of milk. Totally painless. They repeatedly live little doubt that the way to an easy, painless death is to lead a righteous life. And then they also developed the notion of the angel of death, the Malach HaMavet, right? Who appears at the time of death. That's a rabbinic invention, although there are precursor examples in the Tanakh of destroying angels and so on. They also taught that one could elude the angel of death through continuous fervent study of Torah. There's some great stories in the Talmud of in fact, King David as well, that it was his time to die, and he didn't want to die, so he just studied Torah incessantly. And the Malach HaMavet, the angel of death, can't seize you if you're busy studying Torah. So they had to do something to distract him, and so they caused a branch to fall off a tree, which made a noise, which startled him, and he stopped studying Torah for a second, and boom, the angel of death pounced right in and got him.
The story of the Passover, the description of sort of an entity passing over isn't necessarily God. It's a peculiar kind of
The
description.
rabbinic interpretation is generally that it is God. That God did that God's self, as opposed through an agent. The rabbinic period also sees the idea of suffering the pains of the grave as a way for atoning for your sins. There were debates about whether the dead could hear what was going on in the world of the living. There's a saying in the Talmud that the lips of a sage move in his grave when someone says a teaching or halakha in his name. There's a great story, I think it's in the second Sanhedrin, about a guy who overhears two spirits conversing, and he takes advantage of the knowledge he gains from it. It's like they're talking about, what's happening in the stock market or something, and he takes notes and goes out and takes advantage of it. In the Midrash, it talks about the soul spending 3 days trying to get back into the body, but giving up when it sees the body start to decay. Another Midrash says that during the 7 days of mourning, during Shiva, the soul goes back and forth between its spiritual home and physical home that it was leaving behind. Right. So in rabbinic period, we see the idea of punishment in Gehinnom lasting for 12 months. They have discussion of the gateways to Gehenna, that there are certain places that are the gateways to Gehenna. They also talk about an otsar, a treasury, a divine storehouse of souls, where the souls go after we pass away. And there were different opinions about resurrection. Some rabbis believed everyone gets resurrected. Others said only the righteous get resurrected. Others said only those who know Torah gets resurrected. They also had a belief that only those buried in Israel would be resurrected, which led to some sages wanting to be buried in Israel. And there's a custom in some communities that if you get buried outside Israel, of being buried with like a little small dowel, which is supposed to be for the dead person to use to dig his way to Israel.
What about the
Don't we
thing
do
that
some
you have to
bad-
go to your house to take the bodies?
We do some bad dirt.
Right, or sometimes they'll put some dirt from Israel into
Grave.
the grave. So there's a connection between the grave and Israel.
Did the rabbis claim divine inspiration for these thoughts, these interpretations?
No more divine than any of the other stuff they were talking about. In the medieval period, there was a very, sort of elaborate midrashim developed, very interpretive things, depictions of the post-mortem worlds that range from the macabre to the sublime, text full of graphic details of life after death, no less fantastic than Dante's Divine Comedy. Talk of the body being beaten with chains, compartments of Gehenna, different kinds of fire, coals as big as mountains. I mean, they got very creative with their descriptions of hell. It was apparently the thing to do in that time period. And so even just as Dante did it, we had people who did it as well. The philosophers had a different approach. The Sajjadaeon, who was an important rabbi and philosopher in the 10th century, said that ethical moral actions polish the soul and wicked ones tarnish it. Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, is accumulated luminosity, and Gehenna is accumulated tarnish. He affirms resurrection but rejects reincarnation and the transmigration of souls. The Kabbalah gets very complicated. There are all sorts of different views in Kabbalah. And in some Kabbalistic works, you definitely see a belief in reincarnation, and that's mainstream in some parts of the Jewish world today. Many Sephardi Jews believe in reincarnation. Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, who was the chief Sephardic rabbi in Israel for a number of years, caused a great furor and outcry in Israel about 10 years ago when he said that all the people who died in the Holocaust were the reincarnated souls of people who'd sinned in previous lives. Yeah, that caused a huge outcry in Israel. And a lot of people said he could only say such a thing because he was Sephardi and not that many Sephardi Jews died in the Holocaust. That no Ashkenazi rabbi would ever dare say such a thing. But when he said that, it's based on traditional sources. There are sources you can find that would say exactly that, but it's not. Yeah.
So was it safe for him to walk out of the house?
He had plenty of followers. There's also teachings in Kabbalah that say everyone has a unique mission to do in this world. And if you haven't accomplished your mission, you die and you have to come back again until you accomplish your mission. And you keep coming back until you accomplish what your mission is. So it's supposed to encourage you to find what your mission is and do it so you don't have to keep coming back. You can instead enjoy your spiritual life in Gan Eden. There are all sorts of different views of the soul in Kabbalah. There are some that see the soul as a 3-part entity. There's some places where they see it as a 5-part entity. The one that I like and that just makes sense to me, and it's the one I'll share sometimes a Shema meeting or whatever, is the 3-part view of the soul. So we have one level, and those 3 levels are Ruach, Nefesh, and Neshama. Ruach, which also means wind, is sort of the life force, the animating force, what in Eastern philosophy would be called ki. And all living animals have that. And when you die, that just dissipates and it's gone. The Nefesh, the next level of the soul, Nefesh, also means breath or pause, as in Shabbat v'yinafash, to be refreshed, is the level of the soul that has our personalities, our memories, most of what we think of as who we are. And that part, when we die, continues to live on in the memory of others. That it lives on in all the other people whose lives you touched and you had a connection with, and they remember you, you influence them, and in that sense, the nefesh continues. And the third level of the soul, neshama, which also means breath, is the highest level of the soul, which is, we would say, is the spark that comes from God. And when you die, that gets restored to God. So I think of that as just going back to the Otsar, the storehouse of souls. It's returned to its source to God. There's no, this is a sort of monolithic view. There's no single opinion that it's this way or it's that way. We do, in general, though, I'd say almost everybody believes that this world is not all there is, that there is more, but we don't have any way of knowing exactly what that was.
Where does the Hever Kadisha fit into all this?
So the Hever Kadisha is focused on, the physical aspects. So it's not what happens after death, or in the afterlife. It's what happens when you die. So they just prepare the body according to our customs and traditions, which mostly involve washing the body, dressing it in shrouds, and things like that.
But it doesn't have anything to do with like guarding the soul or anything like that.
So there's a tradition not to leave a corpse alone, to have shomrim, to have guardians, so to speak, who will stay with the body at all times, reciting psalms or things like that. And that's not so much necessarily guarding the soul or having to do with that as it is showing respect for the dead.
Okay.
Any questions or comments on the afterlife before we shift gears to the Messiah?
I was thinking about the example of someone who develops a dementia, and part of the personality disappears, dissipates over time. What's the opinion about what is left in terms of divine spark? What part of the soul is left?
For me, I would say, for one thing, we're all created in the divine image, regardless of what your mental capacity is. So the person is still in the divine image, and I would say that has harmed the nefesh part of the soul, but the neshama is always intact, because that's the spark that comes from God. That's God.
Can you elaborate any on the cleansing process and on?
It's torment, affliction,
It is torment.
Oh yeah. Yeah, the purification process is not pleasant. At least that's what, the mainstream thing is. It's not necessarily, like I said, for me, I'm not, I don't personally believe that much in the, reward and punishment. But for those who do, it's a realm of punishment.
So when does the soul actually leave the body? When does it separate?
Well, that's what they were saying in some of these midrashim, that at the moment of death,
Right.
the soul separates, but it kind of comes back, it hangs around, it takes a week, takes the Shiva period to sort of completely separate.
Right. So I had learned that the soul was in a hurry to get back to heaven, because heaven is a beautiful place, and that's what the soul remembered from before it came into the body. And so that when you say Kaddish for the 12 months, 11 months, that the more you say it and the more good deeds you do in that person's honor, rises their soul quicker to heaven.
Right. That's because it came from a story in the Talmud of a guy approached Rabbi Akiva and told him, I'm having these terrible dreams that my father is being punished in Gehinnom. What can I do to ease his path? And Rabbi Akiva taught him to say Kaddish, which is all just praising God, and said, you say this prayer in honor of your father, and it'll sort of turn down the flames a little bit.
Rabbi, when you're talking about the 7 days of Shiva and the soul is trying to go back and forth,
Mhm.
how do you jive that with somebody who's been ill and sick and is prepared for death?
Mhm.
I mean, that would seem, I can understand if somebody dies in violently or in an accident, without any, warning. But for somebody who knows they're dying,
I don't know. I mean, I would think even someone who knows they're dying, the final parting is always difficult. So you're leaving loved ones behind, and you're not coming back. But who knows? that's the point. We don't, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
I'm not sure I understood your statement correctly, but at one time you said, if someone dies quickly, we can kind of, or it's accepted that person was a good person and they don't go to get to the home. So how strong is the belief there? How does that connect maybe with some other beliefs?
About the ease of your death.
It's hard to say. 'Cause on the one hand, they say, oh yeah, the righteous people get a very easy death. On the other hand, there's a story in the martyrology that we recite in Yom Kippur of the 10 rabbis who were all tortured to death, and they were all very righteous. But in general, there's the sense that if you're righteous and you suffer in this world, you get more rewards faster in the next one. And if you're wicked and you prosper in this world, you're going to get punished right away, harder and longer in the next one. There's that idea that we want to see God as just. And so, from that point of view, heaven and hell is seen as the place where the scales get balanced. But I tend to agree more with Rambam Maimonides, who basically said, look, believing in heaven and hell is necessary for people who are at a relatively low level of spiritual development. That, it's sort of like for children. They're not going to do the right thing unless there's some kind of reward. They're not going to avoid wrong behavior unless there's some kind of punishment. But as you're more evolved spiritually, you should do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. Not because you're going to be rewarded, not because there's some extrinsic thing. And you avoid doing the wrong thing, not because you're afraid of getting punished or getting caught. You don't do the wrong thing because it's the wrong thing to do. That we're supposed to internalize those things. And as we're more sophisticated, those things have been internalized. And so in that sense, believing in heaven and hell is kind of training wheels to get you accustomed to behaving the right way so that eventually you'll be behaving the right way just because it's the right thing to do. And Rambam talks about differences between people at different levels of spiritual development. Sometimes it's just a function of age, like the difference between kids and grown-ups. Then even among adults, there are significant differences in how spiritually developed people are. So on to the Messiah. I had an entire semester-long class on Messianism in rabbinical school. So I'm going to try and condense a semester's worth of material into half an hour, which is a challenge. But it was actually the most fascinating class I had in all of rabbinical school. It really was my favorite class because we have so many different views on what the Messiah is about and what it all means. We'll take a look at a couple of the fundamental sources. Isaiah chapter 11 is one of them. There shall come forth a rod from the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow from his root. So who's Jesse? Jesus.
He's David's father.
David's father. All right, so King David is also referred to as Ben Yishai. And Lachado D that we sing on Friday night, he's referred to as Ben Yishai, the son of Jesse. So this is so traditionally the Messiah will be descended from King David. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest on him. His delight shall be in fear of the Lord. With righteousness he'll judge the poor. We have the famous line, the wolf shall live with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid. And as Woody Allen says, the kid won't get much sleep. So this, in Isaiah 11, there's this vision of when the Messiah comes. There's this miraculous world where lions become vegetarians. There's no violence. Everything is peaceful. They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountains. The earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord. He'll gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. So all of us are going to be pulled into Israel. Ephraim shall not envy Judah, which is to say the 10 northern tribes versus the southern tribes. They're not going to envy each other. They're not going to harass each other. It's going to be an era of peace and prosperity.
Question, and a little child shall lead them? I mean, that is like the essence of Christianity.
Oh yeah, well,
It came from here.
so Christianity, in many cases, they really went to great efforts to try and make Jesus's story fit things that were in the Hebrew Bible, including some things that were kind of a stretch. Like Jesus being born in Bethlehem, because he was from Nazareth, and Bethlehem is pretty far away from Nazareth. But it says that the Messiah is going to be descended from King David and born in Bethlehem, and so they had to work to make that fit. In Ezekiel 37, it says, "David, my servant, shall be king over them. They shall all have one shepherd." In other words, there'll be one king. Everyone will follow God's laws. Everyone will dwell in the land of Israel. David will be their prince forever. He'll make a covenant of peace with them. My sanctuary will be in the midst of them forevermore. So the sources in the prophets create a vision of the time when the Messiah comes as being a time of perfection. Peace, harmony, love, everything good. So Rambam, Maimonides, in Mishnah Torah says the King Messiah will in some future time come, restore the kingdom of David to its former power, build the temple, bring together the scattered of Israel, and all the ancient laws will again be enforced. Sacrifices will be offered. Years of release, the Shemitah year and the Jubilee years will be kept as prescribed in the Torah. And whoever does not believe in the coming of the Messiah or does not hope for the coming of the Messiah shows a lack of faith, not only in the prophets, but also in the Torah.
This is very specific to Israel, not to the world.
Yes, it's very specific to Israel. So this vision of Rambam's is what you might call a restorative vision of the Messiah. In other words, we're going to go back to the way things work. We're going to have a temple. We're going to have sacrifices. It's going to be that kind of atmosphere. Isaiah in chapter 65 says, "Behold, I create new heavens and a new earth. The former will not be remembered nor come to mind. I'll rejoice in Jerusalem, joy in my people. The voice of weeping shall no more be heard in her, nor the voice of crying. There shall no more be an infant who lives days, or an old man who has not filled his days. The child shall die 100 years old. The sinner being 100 years old shall be accursed. The wolf and the lamb shall feed together. The lion shall eat straw like the ox." Right? So that whole picture of the world being perfect. And so that's a very different picture than what Rambam just had. So this is a vision of a perfected world, that it's not just going back to what was, but it's becoming something better. It's becoming something that never ever was before. It's new and improved and better than anything we ever saw before. So it's a very different picture than what Rambam had. But there are mixed opinions on that. There are some who say, no, it's not going to be that wild, fantastic thing. Damar Shmuel, Ein bein ha'olam hazeh limot HaMashiach ela she'ibud malchiot bilvad. There's no difference between this world and the days of the Messiah, except for the subjugation to the kingdoms of the world. So, according to this rabbi, the only difference between the days of the Messiah and the current times is Israel will no longer be under foreign domination. That's it. You know, no lions and lambs like that. That's metaphor. You know, he says that when Messiah comes, Israel is no longer under foreign domination. And so,
Also, the Messiah has arrived. Israel is not under
right.
foreign
So if you go by that, one could make the case that David Ben Gurion was the Messiah.
I don't know why Israel is under foreign. I mean, they're not
Foreign
run
threat.
by,
Israel's run by Jews now.
right.
Right? We're not subjects of Rome. We're not subjects of the Babylonians. We have an independent country. So we're not under foreign domination. You know, we still live in the world. We still have to play nicely with other nations, but we're not under foreign domination. Rambam is pretty clear about saying that it's not going to be that magical, mystical thing of lions becoming vegetarians. He says, let no one think that in the days of the Messiah, any of the laws of nature will be set aside, or any innovation be introduced into creation. The world will follow its normal course. The words of Isaiah, the wolf shall dwell with the lamb, are to be understood figuratively, meaning that Israel will live securely among the wicked nations of the world. So Rambam, like I said, 1,000 years ago, he's saying it's not literal, folks. It doesn't mean lions are going to be vegetarians. It means, you know, Israel, who's the lamb, because we're small and we're not as powerful as other ones. We're going to be able to live in peace with these other, you know, bigger nations around us. And Rambam also says, you must not imagine that the Messiah must prove his messianity by signs and miracles, doing something unexpected, bringing the dead to life, or similar things. The principal thing is this: the statutes and precepts of our Torah remain forever, and nothing can be added to them or taken from them. So that's kind of it for Rambam. His view is it's restorative, and there were other rabbis, later rabbis, who took the stuff from Isaiah literally. Said, no, Rambam's wrong. It's going to be vegetarian diets. Going to Kabbalah and the Zohar, they talk about what happens when the Messiah comes. The Shekhinah, the female aspect of the divine presence, will return from exile first and proceed to her house as the holy temple will be built first. And so they say the first thing that's going to happen is the temple will be built. And not only that, in the Zohar, it says that the temple is going to magically come out of heaven in fire. It's not going to be built by human hands. So it says, I shall be to her, says the Lord, a wall of fire round about it, because the future temple will be built on this rock by the hands of the Holy One, blessed be he. It will endure for all generations. Of this temple it's written, greater shall be the glory of this latter house than the former, for the former was built by the hands of man, but this one shall be built by the hands of the Holy One, blessed be he. So there's a belief, and it's based on passages in Ezekiel, that the third temple is going to descend from heaven in a column of fire and just boom, magic and be. And so there are people that believe that. Most of the Hasidic Jews believe that. So most of the Hasidic Jews believe when eventually it's what you would call a passive view of messianism. So there are sort of these different axes of messianism, different pieces. There's the utopian version versus the restorative version. The idea that everything will be perfect versus it's just going back to the way it was once upon a time. Then you have active versus passive. Active, we got to do it. We got to get out there. We got to build the temple. We got to do something. Versus all we do is we sit around and pray, and when God's good and ready, boom, the Messiah shows up, the temple falls out of the sky, and we're good to go. And so, as I say, most of the Hasidic Jews, if you go to the ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods in Jerusalem, that's what they believe. And the ones who are anti-Zionist, there are many who are anti-Zionist. They don't like the state of Israel. They'd rather be living under Palestinian control. Say that because they say, no, we shouldn't be trying to force God's hand. We should be sitting and waiting, because when God's ready, it's all just going to happen.
Is there one? Sounds to me like there's something here for everybody, but is there?
Yeah.
Is there one point of view that's more typical of conservative Judaism?
Will come.
Okay.
So Rabbi Yisrael Ariel, the director of the Temple Institute in Jerusalem, said, contrary to the tendency discernible among recent authors to offer alternate ways of the temple descending from heaven, thus indicating their belief that the precept of building the temple is no longer valid, we have the words of the sages concerning King Solomon, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And to make a long story short, he says, Midrashim can come and go, but nothing of all this has the power to invalidate the commandment of building the temple. So there are people in Israel. The Temple Institute in Jerusalem is a group that very strongly believes we should be out there building the temple. And they don't care if it might start World War III. We should get bulldozers up there, knock down the Dome of the Rock, and build the temple. Very scary people, some of them. In fact, there was a plot back in the 80s. Some people tried to blow up the Dome of the Rock so that they could clear the ground and build the temple. Fortunately, they got caught before they did any actual damage. But there are people who believe that. And so there are two different notions, a couple different notions of active messianism, of doing something to bring the Messiah. So one just says, we got to go out and build the temple and just get to work on it. And then there's teachings from Lurianic Kabbalah, which I like. And what Lurianic Kabbalah teaches, and I've talked about this a little bit before, so some of you may have heard this story, but the Kabbalah teaches the creation of the world was sort of a cosmic work accident. That when God created the world, he created these vessels called sphirot, and poured God's energy into these vessels. The vessels couldn't hold all that energy, and they shattered. And when they shattered, some of God's light stuck to the shattered pieces, and that's the world that we live in. And it's as if you took a jar of honey, smashed it on the floor, there'd be honey still stuck to the shards of glass. And so they picture it like that there's some of God's holiness stuck on the broken pieces of the world that we live in. And our mission is to restore the holiness back to God. And we do that by doing mitzvot. And when we do enough mitzvot, when we've done enough bringing those sparks back to God, we've healed the world, fixed the world, and created, in essence, the perfect world. And the Messiah comes then, not to make it happen, but sort of as the graduation ceremony. To say, Mazel tov, you guys did it. You created the kind of world into which I could come. But the work is really up to us. That we have to do it. We have to create it. We have to do all the hard work. It's not that we sit on our tuchus and pray and some guy with a magic wand comes and makes everything better. It's no, we got to go out there and fix this broken world that we live in. And for the Kabbalists, you fix it by doing any mitzvah. And it doesn't matter whether it's lighting candles on Shabbat or giving money to the poor or feeding the homeless, whatever it is, doing any of the mitzvot, they're all considered to be things that bring that progress. And that's actually one reason why Chabad is so big on getting people to put on tefillin and getting women to light candles on Friday night, because they believe any mitzvah that's done will help speed about the coming of the Messiah. Personally, I think I'd rather that they focused on getting people to give more to charity or something like that, because that equally does, because it's equally a mitzvah, but it's not what they focus on. And so this conception of redemption is no longer catastrophic. When duty has been fulfilled, the Son of David, the Messiah, will come of himself, for his appearance at the end of days is only a symbol for the completion of a process, a testimony that the world has in fact been amended. thus it becomes possible to avoid what they call the travails of the Messiah. There's this thing called the birth pangs of the Messiah, that there'll be a very terrible time before the Messiah comes. And the Kabbalists say, no, we can avoid those terrible times by fixing the world incrementally, a bit at a time, by raising these holy sparks. So there are, so here's where we get to one of the differences of opinion with the Christians. Of course, the Christians say that Jesus was the Messiah. So how do we know that Jesus was not the Messiah from our perspectives? And this is in Rambam. He said the rabbis, the sole difference between the present Messianic days is delivery from servitude to foreign powers. If he does not succeed, or if he is killed in war, it's certain that he's not the Messiah promised in the Torah. So one look at the world around us. There's fighting. There's hatred. Look at what's happening in Syria. Clearly the Messiah hasn't come if you have 400,000 people killed in a civil war in Syria, because we're clearly not living in an era of peace. So that's the perspective that says the Messiah hasn't come. Rambam says, almost all people have, through Jesus and Muhammad, become acquainted with the idea of the Messiah, with the words of the Torah and divine precepts. Through them, the knowledge of the Bible spread even into the remotest islands and unto many nations uncircumcised in heart and uncircumcised in flesh. So he says Jesus and Muhammad did important work in basically preparing the world for the coming of the Messiah. That when the Messiah comes, they're at least familiar with the idea. They've got the concept. So they're sort of primed for it. They're ready for it. So he says, even though we don't believe those guys were the Messiah or prophets or whatever, they still served a important function, and God works in mysterious ways. And then we have the interesting example of Chabad. So
I have a question.
Mhm.
Rabbi Shmuel Butman says, how can Lubavitchers continue to believe that the Rebbe is Mashiach after the tragic event of the 3rd of Tammuz? What was the tragic event?
The tragic event of the 3rd of Tammuz was the death of the Rebbe. So that was the day Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson died. And so some Lubavitchers, some Chabadniks won't even say that it's the day he died. They refer to it euphemistically as the tragic event of the 3rd of Tammuz, because the Rebbe didn't really die. Right. And so this rabbi asked, isn't that a non-Jewish belief to say that he didn't really die or that he's coming back from the dead? So they say, many Torah sources refer to Mashiach, the Messiah, as rising from the dead. Starting with the Talmud and Sanhedrin, Rav said, if he, the Mashiach, is from the living, then he's like Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, and if he's from the dead, then he's like Daniel the Delightful One. So they claim that because of this line, there's a source for saying that it's possible that the Messiah is someone who's coming back from the dead. So there's a split in the Chabad world. There are, in Israel, almost all the Chabadniks are Messianic. Here in America, I think it's more like 50-50. If you ask a Chabad rabbi, do you believe that the Rebbe is the Messiah? The odds here are 50-50 or better that they'll say, yes, the Rebbe is the Messiah. He's coming back from the dead. There are some in the Orthodox world who say, can't be. I have an interesting book at home called the Rebbe, the Messiah, and the Scandal of Orthodox Indifference. So he says that there's a religion that says the Messiah has been here already and is going to come back from the dead, and that religion's not Judaism. That religion's Christianity. So he believes that the Chabadniks who believe that the Rebbe is the Messiah have cut themselves off from Judaism, that they are no longer Jewish. He does not consider their meat kosher. He would not eat it. And in a way, the Chabad people who believe that are exactly like the early Christians. Exactly. Because the early Christians were Jews. The early Christians did everything the other Jews did. The early Christians brought sacrifices to the temple. The early Christians did all the same prayers. Early Christians did everything the other Jews did. They just believed that Jesus was the Messiah. Guess what? You got Chabad people who are exactly the same. They look exactly like all other Jews, but they believe that their Rebbe's the Messiah, and he's coming back from the dead. And I think that, they are, and on the one hand, I wouldn't say that they're not Jewish anymore, because we're not that rigid on what you believe. So you could believe in the wrong Messiah and still be Jewish. A Jew for Jesus who's halachically Jewish is still Jewish. Most of us would say he's not right, but halachically they'd still be Jewish. But they've taken it in a direction that cuts them off from the rest of the Jewish world by believing that. And I think that's a mistake. I think that's a bad thing.
But how do you reconcile that with what Chabad is doing here in various communities, where they're taking Jews who are not really affiliated or learning or studying or
You don't have to reconcile it. You can do good work and be a heretic.
How who they are, but what they're doing. I mean, is it good to support them if they're bringing Jews back into the fold, or no, because they're ulterior motives?
Personally, I would not support them at all. Because they don't talk about what they believe in. They almost never publicly talk about what they believe in, because they know what they believe is completely at odds with every single person in this room believes. So they don't go there, because they know they'll lose a lot of support. So most Chabad people are fundamentalists. They actually believe the world was created 5,777 years ago. Is there anybody in this room who believes the world was created 5,777 years ago? No. Right? And the odds are pretty good that they believe Schneerson was the Messiah. Sure, none of us believe that. I believe Schneerson was a tremendous rabbi. He was an incredible force for good. He did a lot of good. He was a great man, but he was a man, wasn't a Messiah.
Did he ever, because I'm new here, did he ever say he was? Or
No.
they just...
No, they made him into it. But Jesus is much, but the same thing happened with Jesus. Jesus never said he was God. His followers made him into God.
They did it after his death.
They did it after his death. That's customary what they do, apparently.
But in relation to Chabad, it's also a two-way street. It's not just that Chabad is luring people in, it's that people are going to them because they are the real Jews. They're the ones that remind me of my great-grandfather in Poland.
Not that they're real Jews, but that they're providing something that these Jewish people are not finding in the traditional branches of Judaism.
No, I agree with you. I'm just saying it's a two-way street. Some of them go there precisely because they feel this is authentic Judaism. I don't have to be kosher. I don't have to observe Shabbat. As long as I go to Chabad, I'm authentic.
Right. Whereas for me, this right now, what we're doing here, that's authentic Judaism. And so I would support our institutions. I wouldn't support their institutions. There are places and circumstances where I might work with them. I worked with Chabad to set up a soup kitchen for elderly Jews in Ukraine, because there was no one else there doing it. But that was not about getting their souls. That was about feeding them. That was a very, kind of practical thing, concrete thing.
I find this interesting. My father was a conservative rabbi, more left-wing than here because I grew up with an organ.
Mm-hmm.
But and I miss it. But that's a different matter. But on Passover, when we would do the cup of Elijah, because Elijah's supposed to announce the Messiah, he would always make us pass it around and everyone put some of their own cup in there, because he said the Messiah will not come unless we all work to make this a better world.
I do the same thing.
And
I love that.
Yeah, no, I
that's part of what I'm
saying.
trying to
So
That was
I
in
do
my
that.
thing.
So,
Yeah.
so I have it's a little bit of a detour, but a great story about the organ. So, when Rabbi David Wolpe took over at Sinai Temple in Los Angeles, which is the biggest conservative synagogue on the West Coast, it's the sort of our flagship institution on the West Coast. So Rabbi Wolpe takes over as the new head rabbi, and they have an organ.
Around when was that?
Early 90s.
You said like 20 years or something.
Over 20 years. And so he gets there and they've got an organ on Friday night. And he didn't like the organ. So he talks to the president of the shul, and he says, I don't know about this organ. And the president looks at him and says, Rabbi, that organ's been here 100 years. How long you been here? End of the discussion.
That was it.
So now I'll try and summarize contemporary views of the Messiah, and they're all over the map, and I think that's a good thing because we don't know, and so I think it's good that everybody can kind of find something that works for them. We've been talking about Chabad, that there are many of them who believe that the Rebbe was the Messiah. The ones who don't believe that believe the Rebbe was a really great guy. And they would say that if our generation had merited the Messiah, he would have been it, but we didn't merit the Messiah, so it didn't happen. And that belief, I have no problem. That's okay. You can believe your Rebbe was good enough, because that means someone else's Rebbe also could have been good enough, it's fine. But as soon as you think your Rebbe was the Messiah, then you're automatically excluding everybody else who thinks their Rebbe could have been the Messiah. Then you have the religious Zionists. So the religious Zionists are the sort of right wing in Israel. They're called Dati Leumi, National Zionists, and they see Israel as Reshit Tzmichat Gulatenu, the beginning of the flowering of our redemption, which is something that we also say in the Birkat Hamazon, the grace after meals, whereas the Haredi Jews don't say that blessing in it because they don't believe it. They don't see the state of Israel as the beginning of the redemptive process, the beginning of the Messianic process. The Neturei Karta, which are most of the Haredi Hasidic Jews in Israel, have that we'll call passive messianism, that we just sit, we pray, and their view is based on a passage called the Three Oaths. It's found in the Talmud, the tractate Ketubot. And what are the three oaths? The three oaths are, first, that Israel shouldn't go up, that Jews shouldn't make aliyah, shouldn't go up to Israel in a wall. In other words, they say we shouldn't all go to Israel to try and take over Israel by force. That God will return Israel, and the nations of the world won't rebel against it. And he forces the idol worshippers to swear that they're not going to subjugate Israel more than necessary. Tear me down. And so they have that passive utopian view that everything's going to be miraculously better, and we just sit and pray and wait for it to happen. And so therefore, from their perspective, Zionists are contrary to the coming of the Messiah, because we're trying to force God's hand. Instead of just waiting patiently for God to make it happen, we're trying to force it to happen. And they say that's bad, that messes the whole thing up. It's really astounding. You can walk around Mea Sharim, the ultra-Orthodox district in Jerusalem, or one of the many ultra-Orthodox districts in Jerusalem, And you can see signs if you read Hebrew that say, Ein ma'avar letzionim. No passage to Zionists. That means all of us that believe in Israel as the homeland for the Jews, stay out.
So why are they
It's-
there?
They're there because it's still a holy place, and they believe it's okay for individuals to go there, but we shouldn't have secular power, right? That when we have power is when God brings the Messiah and the temple columns from heaven and the Sanhedrin's restored. It's not going to be a democracy. It's going to be, ruled by rabbis and that sort of thing. Mainstream reform thought, I'd say, is summarized by a book I have as well called There Is No Messiah and You're It. Right, so we should all get out and do tikkun olam, fixing the world, go make the world a better place, and that's the Messiah. I studied the top with Rabbi David Hartman, Zichrono Livracha, a while back, and he said something I thought is really beautiful that I agree with. The Messiah is not so much a prediction for the future as it is a critique of the present. Okay, so the idea is we need that perfect picture. We need that idea of a world at peace, of harmony, of everyone getting together, so that we know what we're striving for, so that we can compare that vision with the broken world that we live in now and know where we're aiming. Know what we're trying to do, know what's wrong with the world we're in because we're not there. And so I think that's a very good way to view the Messiah, that it's not predicting what's going to happen, but it's telling us what's wrong with what we have now. As long as we see things happening like what's happening in Syria or in many other parts of the world, we know the Messiah hasn't come yet, that we still got a lot of work to do. As the professor of that class, Steve Lowenstein, said at the end of the class, the Messiah always needs to be out in the future, because once the Messiah comes, the movie's over.
That's it.
That's it. What else is there?
Right,
And so for that reason, even though if you went by the view of Shmuel, who said there's no difference between the days of the Messiah and these days, except that Israel's not under foreign domination, you go by that, David Ben-Gurion's the Messiah, I don't go there, because that's not enough. It needs to be more. We need to have that vision of something to strive for, of what we're working towards. And it is the case. If the Messiah ever comes, that's it. We're done. Then what? It can't ever happen. It needs to always be out there in the future. It needs to always be something that we're striving for, but probably never attaining. But we can sure get a hell of a lot closer than we are now. And so my own view, as informed by those teachings from Lurianic Kabbalah, are that the Messiah won't come until she is no longer needed. It's not that says Messiah can't be a woman. So when the Messiah appears, it's the graduation service. God's way of saying, Mazel Tov, you created a world of peace and harmony, and we'll know the Messiah has come when our Muslim brethren invite us to build our temple on the Dome of the Rock, on the Temple Mount right next to the Dome of the Rock. And they say, you know what, Jews, there's plenty of room up here. Why don't you build your temple next door? We'll all come up here and pray. Because I do pray for the restoration of the temple, and that's what I pray for. And I don't pray that it's a place where we're going to have a holy barbecue. I pray it's a place where we're going to go, we're going to pray.
Yes, no.
Because there's also the teaching that we just had in Isaiah that there will be no more violence on my holy mountain. No violence on my holy mountain means we're not going to be killing animals. We're just going to, or people, or anything else. We're just going to go up there, we'll pray, we'll have peace, we'll have harmony, and that's how we'll know Messiah's.
It'll be a long time.
Don't hold your breath. It's like the joke, the town of Helm hired a night watchman so that he'd be awake all night, so that the Messiah came, he'd go around and share the good news and let everybody know the Messiah's come. And what they say about that job is it didn't pay very well, but it was steady work.
Thank you,
Very
Rabbi.
good.
Sure.
Thank you. This is-
So no class next week or the week after. We get 2 weeks of break. I'm gonna be in Israel. So what am I gonna do? I'm gonna hang out with my kids. Oh, and I